冇聲，有冇聲？有聲。OK，早晨啊，咁多位。
Members, good morning. We formed a quorum. May I call the meeting to order? This is the subcommittee to follow up issues related to inadequate housing and irrelevant housing policies, the second meeting. Right. The first thing on the agenda is to deal with an application for late membership. We have got a letter from Mrs. Regina Ip asking to join our subcommittee. In accordance with our ROP 23D, to accept the application, we need to seek the permission of the subcommittee. If there is no objection, then the application is approved. We've also received application for withdrawal from Mr. Gary Chen and Mr. Aunok Keen. All right, if there is no objection, then the applications are accepted. Confirmation of minutes of our meeting held on the 14th of December 2018. The minutes have been circulated to members and our secretariat has not received any proposal for amendments. All right. In our first meeting, members have asked for the suggestions for our discussion to be recorded, and please refer to our list of items for discussion. Okay. Date of our next meeting and agenda. Subsequent to the last meeting, together with Ms. Andrew Wen, our Deputy Chairman, we had a meeting with the administration. On the 19th of December, and we've come up with a list of outstanding items for discussion, and is in paper CB 1485/1819/01. The Undersecretary, as well as the Project Director of the Task Force on Transitional Housing, will come and report to us an overview of the measures for tackling IHHS, and we will first discuss the general issues with the administration, and then in February we'll have another meeting to go into issues of greater interest to members. And then in March, April, and May, we hope to invite organizations and academics working for IHHS to come with us, as just suggested, and they will include URA, HKCSS, and even the CIC, and with new ways to build transitional housing. And universities, including the PolyU, have got suggestions for transitional housing, and will invite these organizations to an exchange with us. And then in June, we hope to hold a public hearing to receive public views from various community groups and individuals. So that will be our plan up to June. And then in July, Chairman of the Housing Panel, Mr. Wilson All, would like us to discuss policies and measures regarding rehousing for households affected by government actions. And then we have other miscellaneous items such as rent control, rent subsidies, standard terms in tenancy agreements, etc., to be confirmed for discussion at a later meeting. So, members, do you have any view on the proposals I've just outlined? If there is no objection, that will be our plan. Yes, Mr. Jeremy Tam. No, I just like to request to speak. Oh, all right, for the next item. We've invited the Undersecretary to attend our meeting, and they have newly set up a task force on transitional housing. The project director will be with us as well. Prior to the meeting, I've invited the Secretariat to prepare a research report on overseas practices in dealing with IHHS, and FRS is now deposited with the library of the council, and they are going to prepare a summary for us for our next meeting. Thank you.
你幫我寫低啲名啊！又有麥美娟。好，早晨啊！
Good morning. We're now on agenda item number 4, measures alleviating the housing difficulties of inadequately housed households. Welcome government officials to the meeting. We have the Undersecretary as well as Ms. Esther Leung, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Chen Nat Ming, Project Director of the Task Force on Transitional Housing, and Mr. Stephen Wong, Project Director 2 of the Task Force. Undersecretary, please. Thank you. I'd like to brief members on government's measures and relevant policies in alleviating the housing difficulties of adequately housed households, IHHS. We've prepared a paper for members' information, and it's been submitted to members prior to the meeting. The government has discussed with the council about matters related to IHHS, and we've set out the reason discussions in the footnote. Now, the problem is all because of a supply and demand imbalance. The government is very determined to address this problem to provide affordable housing to improve members' quality of living. And as set out in para 4, the government announced the LTHS report in December 2014, and the government will adopt a flexible and supply-led approach to tackle this problem. The community has got various discussions on this, and the public are of the view that we should give priority to addressing the housing needs of IHHS, and public rental housing is the fundamental solution for solving this problem. We are going to follow the long-term goals set by the LTHS, and the policy address 2018 set out that there will be more resources for public housing, and then 70% of new land identified will be used for public housing. From time to time, the government would rezone land for private housing for public housing development. And in 2014, it was announced that plot ratio of residential developments can be increased by 20%, and the Executive Council agreed in December 2018 to allow increase of domestic plot ratio of public housing sites by a further 10% to a maximum of 30% where technically feasible, excluding those in the north of Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula, which are more densely populated. For details, please refer to paras 8 to 10. The government will continue to implement measures in the short, medium, and long term, including rezoning, increasing development intensity, and developing new developing areas. The Housing Authority will continue to work with relevant departments to proactively explore ways to better utilize identified existing public housing sites, as well as to expedite construction works. And then the government will also take other measures to alleviate the housing difficulties of IHHS. And for details, please refer to para 14 to 16. There are views in the community that other measures can be adopted to help the IHHS. During the long-term housing strategy consultation, public views were received, and we've set out an analysis of views received. Because of the urgent need for housing, these measures may not be of use in time, and I will highlight some of them. Tenancy control is a very controversial issue. We're concerned that it may bring unexpected consequences and may be detrimental to grassroots households which we intend to help. As for rent subsidy, given the very tight housing supply, rent subsidy may cause some landlords to increase rentals, and rent subsidy may turn to additional rent. And as for vacancy tax, in order to encourage first-hand properties to be sold ASAP, the policy address in 2018 proposed a special rates, and we're now working on the bill and prepare to submit a relevant bill to the Council within the 2018-19 legislative session.
We've heard a lot of views about transitional housing. In the previous policy address, we understand that it will take time to develop land, so we will be cooperating with NGOs to launch traditional housing. So under the Transport and Housing Bureau, we've set up a task force on transitional housing. So with regard to the relevant procedures, we will be assisting NGOs to provide transitional housings. Now there are more than 10 projects which are initiated by NGOs, and we will be looking for sites for possible transitional housing. So these are set out in paragraph 25 to 31 of the paper. In sum, the government considers that the crux of the housing difficulties currently faced by IHH lies with the housing demand-supply imbalance. The fundamental solution to this problem is a continued increase in the supply of land and housing. The government continue to endeavor to increase public housing supply in accordance with the housing supply targets under LTHS so as to genuinely address the housing needs of the IHH. So now we will open the floor to members. 4 members have raised their hands, and they intend to ask questions. Mr. Andrew Wen, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, let me talk about the paper. After reading the paper, I'm really disappointed because half of the paper is not directly related to the issue. For paragraphs 1 to 13 is about the LTHS. So if LTHS works, we don't have much work to do today. And we do not need transitional housing, and we do not need other measures to alleviate the housing problems of IHH. The Undersecretary has mentioned LTHS 10 times. He says that the LTHS targets would be implemented, but that cannot be done. There's just bureaucracy, and half of the paper has nothing to do with the present problems, and now you're telling us about compassionate housing, rent subsidy, and also the express housing allocation scheme, etc. You also even talked about the community care fund. So I would like to make a few points. Why am I spending time on this? I think the government's problem is, on the surface, they are trying to deal with the IHH problem. It seems that they are very proactive. However, their actions are really passive. Look at their response. It really shows what's actually on their mind. This is a slip of the tongue. So this is really far from ideal. And also the Undersecretary and also Mr. Frank Chen came to our meeting. They already told us that in the coming 10 years, the housing targets cannot be met. So how do you solve this problem? Well, for transitional housing and tenancy control, I think these are effective measures. You should at least target the symptoms. You should at least give me a painkiller. And just now, the secretary told us that he's not going to give us the painkiller. Why can't you implement tenancy control, rent control? Why can that not be done? Now, for people who are in the who are on the waiting list for PRH, if they have waited for 3 years, you should do something. So you should have such a policy, and then if you have such a policy, then the people would know what to do to protect their privacy. And also for rent subsidy, there are other measures to help the people in need. So I hope that we can try to get some answers from the government, but it seems that they are just wasting our time. And also there is another area that I'm dissatisfied with. That is about transitional housing. Now the progress is really slow. We only have 200 units or so. Yeah, you have done something, but that's far from enough. Well, for LTHS, in the coming 10 years, we will still need 40,000 more units. So we need tens of thousands of transitional housing units. Only by doing that can we solve the problem. But for your figures, you say that you just build 1,000 units or so. That's really far from enough. So will you have any concrete measures? For example, on some STT sites, can you build transitional housing? And how about phase 2 of Disney? Can that site be used? In the past, you've been discussing with Disney, maybe some of the terms on their contracts can be changed so that would help the situation. Thank you, Mr. Wen, for your comments and questions. As for LTHS, we understand that the LTHS will be updated every year. So in the coming 10 years, we understand what the needs are. Well, there are a lot of factors that would affect the supply targets. As for the amount of supply, that's another issue. For LTHS, it's the direction for us to move forward. As for the paper, we hope that we can give you a comprehensive picture of what the government is doing. Just now, Mr. Wen mentioned other measures. For example, transitional housing. You don't think the progress is satisfactory. But for transitional housing, we are playing a role of facilitator. We are facilitating NGOs to do this. So we are not too sure about the future amount. But there are a lot of projects that are underway. And the potential in the community has been released. We try to be flexible so that more transitional housing units can be built. As for concrete actions, we will really help the NGOs to do things. We have come into contact with a lot of NGOs and concerned groups, and they have expressed their views to us. We are assisting these groups to become project proponents, and we will try to find ways to implement their proposals. I think he's just going around in circles. Mr. Jeremy Tam, I have several questions. First, about industrial buildings, which will be converted into transitional housing. I think there is only a term of 5 years, and you have to apply for renewal after 5 years. For industrial building owners, there is not enough security because they have to convert the whole building into residential units. So what will happen after 5 years? And are industrial buildings suitable for people to live in? For example, how about dark rooms? As we understand, the footprints of industrial buildings tend to be bigger if, well, there may be some units that do not have windows, unless you allow units without windows. So are you prepared to do that? Are you going to tell us that for the industrial building residential units, you would allow some of them to be dark rooms, that is, without windows? Thank you for your question, Mr. Tam. You asked about dark rooms. Our position is this. We want to be more flexible. Do we allow dark rooms? I think we should focus on remedies. If under the present situations, this cannot be done, but the project proponents can come up with remedies. If they can ensure the safety and health of the residents, if compensations can be made, then this may be considered. There have been examples before. For example, under the community housing movement, well, there was a problem concerning natural lighting, so there were obstacles. However, we eventually solved the problem. We provided an artificial lighting system so as to compensate. What do you mean, turning on the light? Yes, that's artificial. That's an artificial lighting system, and also mechanical ventilation, so that we won't compromise the safety. So you mean that there will be ventilation fans, and then there will be light bulbs, and then you can solve the problem of dark rooms? No, it's not that simple. For mechanical ventilation and artificial lighting, we have to make sure that the tenant's health would not be compromised. These are very important principles in the law. Now, for the To Kwa Wan project, it is because we have adopted this flexible principle, so that's why it could be implemented. For the To Kwa Wan project, I want to know why all the rules can be complied with. You ask the landlord to provide such facilities, so you have already have an example, so maybe you can give me the details, then I can analyze whether it is an adequate accommodation. Well, you are talking about artificial lighting. Well, at the end of the day, it's a light. And mechanical ventilation, of course, you have to use machines for ventilation. So why is it so special? Originally, there was this window requirement, so I want to know why you do not require windows anymore. And then I have another question. I don't know whether this has to do with the vacancy rates. Yes, I understand that developers are now launching the units faster. Maybe it's because of the declining economic situation. But I wonder if you've paid attention to this. That is, in terms of tax, there have been changes. In the past, a developer can sell his flats before its completion, and after getting the occupation permit, then he can put some money into his account. But things have changed in the last year. That is, they have to complete the building first. That is, the buyer would have to finish all the relevant procedures before the developer can put the money in the account. So the turnover process is slower. This happened in the last year or so. So don't give people a false impression that is your special rates is really working. So maybe you can go back and think about this and whether this will have an impact on your policy or measures. Ms. Mack, I don't think there's anything new about this document. Well, the only thing new is that you have set up the task force on transitional housing, and there are 2 new project directors. In the paper, you talked about tenancy control and rent subsidy, but I think you still adopt a very rigid attitude. Now, for rent subsidy, you are saying that you will push up the rents, and for tenancy control, as a consequence, the housing supply will go down. But I think you should adopt a 3-pronged approach. That is, even for second-hand properties, you should impose a vacancy tax, tenancy control, and rent subsidy. But the government has been telling us that if you provide rent subsidy, you will push up the rent.
And you've never told us whether the three together will create a synergy. You've never mentioned that. And as for a vacancy tax, I think you should cover all residential properties, first-hand and second-hand alike. And then, of course, we all know that in the long term, increasing supply is a fundamental solution. But in the short term, if everything is not going to work, what will? And as for transitional housing, I just heard from the Undersecretary that you have set up a task force to work on technical aspects such as ventilation and, in fact, some buildings already got that. But I think there are loopholes and in some service apartments. And if you include the requirement of ventilation systems in transitional housing, you should incorporate what problems you've identified of existing surface apartments. Now, you want to play the role of a facilitator in providing transitional housing, but this is not our expectation. In addition to being a facilitator, the government should be more involved. You should provide assistance and even resources. If you really just rely on NGOs and the two project directors, that is not good enough. Well, we have a lot of vacant sites. For instance, in Kwai Chung, there are many idle school premises. You can use them. You should provide financial assistance. You should provide manpower. A task force providing advice by the side is not going to help. The government should be more involved and be hands-on. Thank you, Ms. Mack, for your suggestion. The government's position on tenancy control and rent subsidy is very clearly set out in the paper. I understand that Ms. Mack would want us to implement measures to provide relief to IHHS, but given the current housing demand-supply imbalance, measures implemented with good intention may bring undesirable consequences. So we will have a meeting dedicated to this topic at a later stage. As regards transitional housing, the characteristics of each project are different. Some are on government sites, some on private lots, and some are in private buildings. So the cases vary, and we want to provide adequate and safe housing, and we will work more on that. The two project directors will provide technical advice, and we also play the role of a promoter and facilitator. We do not just stop at giving advice. We will try to help them to remove the red tape, and if there are administrative measures, we will help them to resolve the difficulties, and we'll explore what subsidy programs are suitable and assist them to apply for assistance under these programs. We will also discuss with government departments to identify vacant government sites and buildings suitable for transitional housing. We will maintain a dialogue with interested organizations. We'll see whether they're interested in turning government idle sites and buildings into transitional housing. So in addition to giving advice, we also play the role of facilitator and assistant. We understand that Ms. Mack would want us to do more. I can undertake to members that we will do our utmost to contribute to the provision of transitional housing. Mr. Shukajan, whenever we talk about AHHS, we will propose tenancy control and rent subsidy and a special rates, and you give us the same answer. The Undersecretary told us that it is going to offer assistance in promoting and facilitating the development of transitional housing. In 1780, I'd like to know the number of housing, social housing schemes launched by NGOs and the number of households and people who have benefited in 2017-18. Now, in 2017-18, the number of applications received and rejected and the main reasons for rejection. Of course, I mean, under your plan, how many years are you going to take for community housing to resolve the problems of SDUs? For those living in inadequate housing and SDUs, they can be in squatters and pick sheds and industrial buildings and SDUs, so on and so forth. Have you got a survey or statistics of the living conditions of IHHS? If not, how are you going to formulate policies to address their needs? Now, the Methodist Church has got a scheme. It is a social support scheme. It has recently done a survey on SDUs and mental health. The major stress of SDU participants have come from housing. 70% were worried of rent increase, and 60% of them did not envisage any improvement in their situation. Are you concerned about the mental health of people living in SDUs? Have you got any support for them? 70%, 60% of them were worried about their future. Have you got any stopgap measures to help them? And Ms. Alice Mack talked about idle school premises. Reports number 65 of the Audit Commission said that as of 2015, there were 234 vacant school premises, accounting for 1/4 of the schools in Hong Kong. And that is about 100 of them are not being put into proper use, involving 30 hectares of land. What plans do you have to turn vacant school premises into transitional housing? Thank you. Mr. Shill's questions cover a number of issues, and I'll briefly respond first. As for data, well, they may not be readily available now. We can give them to you later. For instance, in 2017-18 community housing schemes, we have offered about 200 units. 200 units, yes, 200 units to help IHHS, round about 200. We have got quite a number of applications, but we have to take into account the cost of conversion and also the living conditions. And we have got some that can really help them. As regard the number of applications and also those rejected, I can provide you with the data later. As for using transitional housing to address the housing problem, this is not a desirable solution. The fundamental solution to IHHS is by means of public housing. Relying on transitional housing is not a solution at all. So, as said in the paper, we are trying very hard to identify more sites for PRH construction to house those who need housing. As for the survey on SDUs and whether a rent control will bring, rent increases will bring mental stress to SDU occupants, I will try to find out whether we have dedicated services for them. And as for idle school sites, I think some of the vacant school sites may not have immediate use, but they have been reserved for other purposes. Take for example, a vacant school site was reserved for a research center or for archive of a university, but then the university concerned decided not to use it, and so the site is now available for other use. So we have to first identify what school premises are available. We maintain very close liaison with the lands department. We understand that some school premises available for transitional housing. Will coordinate with NGOs. Can the Undersecretary promise to give me statistics on different types of SDUs or different IHHS, those living in caged housing and squatters and pigsties and so forth? In 2016, by census, there were 92,000 SDUs, housing 91,800 households, and housing 209,000 occupants. I have that figures. I just want an update, and please give me a breakdown of different types of inadequate housing. Thank you. Ms. Chen. So I'm sure you really want to identify sites for housing. Unfortunately, many SDUs and grassroots do not feel the effect of your efforts. Now, land shortage for housing has been a problem with us for many years. Many SDU occupants are fully qualified to live in public housing. The problem is we do not have sufficient PRH units for them, and so they have to put up with high rents. And it is the government's responsibility to provide housing for them. For transitional housing and even land for housing, they can not produce flats overnight. You must identify short-term solutions. So what immediate measures do you have? I am rather disappointed, just like other members, when I look at your responses to tenancy control and rent subsidy. You said that rent subsidy would turn into additional rent. And I'd like to ask the project directors and undersecretary, do you know that even without rent subsidy and tenancy control, the landlords can raise rents continuously? If you do not offer rent control and subsidy, then there are problem. Now, if you have tenancy control, you can also control rent. And for those who have been waiting for PRH for more than 3 years, they have no choice. Do you want them to become street sleepers? They have no choice but to stay in SDUs. What immediate relief can you provide? Do they have to wait for 2 years before transitional housing is available? So you must provide immediate relief. What immediate relief can you provide them? And the government's responsibility. You say that you play the role of a facilitator and promoter. You can ask NGOs to help, but the final responsibility rests with the administration. We have proposed a special fund for transitional housing. For instance, the HKCSS is running a community housing movement. HKCSS is not really has no expertise in providing housing. So you consider giving them a dedicated fund, and I'd like to know what factors are you still considering? Thank you, Ms. Chen. Yes, it's not easy to identify land. The task force on housing supply submitted its report in February. On the 31st of December last year. It has got 3 short to medium-term options and 5 medium to long-term options. Now for SDUs, not all SDUs are eligible for public housing. Some of the occupants are not eligible for SDUs. We know that they are living in inadequate housing or SDUs. And transitional housing will be operated by NGOs because they provide a diversity of services. NGOs have different target service recipients, but they are experienced in serving different groups.
Well, some NGOs are to help ethnic minorities, some others are to help CSSA recipients. So in the community, there's more flexibility. And you talked about the community housing movements of the HKCSS is supported by the Community Chest and the Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship Development Fund. So they are working together to provide community housing movement. As for the Nam Chang Street project, it also got funding from the Community Care Fund. So with these endeavors, they may not be enough for all the IHHS. However, we still have to do something. As for tenancy control and rent subsidy, the government has stated its stance very clearly. Now, for this subcommittee, we will be discussing all this in details in the future. Now, how about immediate relief? Yes, we understand that some SDU tenants are not eligible for PRH. I'm talking about those eligible ones. So do they still have to wait for the transitional housing, because now you're only providing 210 units? We have different arrangements. Now, if they are on CSSAs, then there is already rent subsidy. And there is also compassionate rehousing, and they can be rehoused in PRH earlier. And these are not subject to yearly quota. It's my turn to ask questions. I welcome the government officials, and I don't think it's true that the government hasn't done anything. A few weeks ago, they launched a Untitled Street project, and 210 transitional housing units will be provided. This has already been passed by the relevant district council, but of course, this is far from enough. Just now, Mr. Siu Ka-chen asked a question that I want to ask. That is, how many transitional housing units will be built by the government? We really want the data from the government. I myself have done something. I've gone online and I've looked in the newspapers. I did accounting. And now you have 120 units under the light housing program, and then for Nam Chang Street, 90 units, Yam Chau Street, 210 units, and then for Yukon Estate, 217 units, and for Housing Society at Meitong Estate and Pak Tin Estate, 84 units. So in total, about 1,200 units. This is what I got from the relevant countings. So can the government give us a more detailed list? For example, in 2017, how many transitional housing units were provided, and how about 2018, 2019? Can you give us such a list? I myself did it. I'm sure you can do it. Do you have a target number? The DAB has suggested 10,000 units in 3 years' time. So do you have a target? I hope there can be long-term plans. Thank you for your question. As for the Yam Chau Street project, it's a very good example. We would like to thank the District Council for its support. So for the Yam Chau Street project, its planning period was very long, and Mr. Chang has been helping us a lot. Now, why is it so difficult to set targets for transitional housing? Because there are many uncertainties. We have to collect a lot of information about the background, for example, whether the site is suitable for transitional housing. And we also have to look at the operators' arrangements. Each project has its own difficulties. So it's very difficult for us to tell you what the target numbers are when it comes to transitional housing units. Just now, Mr. Chang gave us some figures. Actually, now we are dealing with a dozen projects. Well, many of these projects are underway, and there are legal issues to be resolved. So we cannot make an announcement before the projects are finalized. As for Meitong Estate and Black Tin Estate, they are not transitional housing. These estates are to be redeveloped, but now we are refurbishing them so that people on the waiting list can be rehoused earlier. And the Housing Society is also reviewing its programs, and an extra option is provided for the IHHS. The HA will be looking at the HS review, and it will consider whether it will also join the plan. Yes, the supply of transitional housing is not enough. However, our position is like this. Even though the number is small, we'll try our best to help. Helping one more household is useful, and we will try to help the IHHS to resolve their problems. For identifying sites for housing, we have encountered many problems. For example, the relevant district may not agree, and there are disputes about the sites. We hope members can support our effort of identifying sites so that we can build more PRH and we can solve the problem for IHHS. Yes, the number of units may not be many, but still we want to help. I hope that you can come up with a list for us on transitional housing. And Mr. Sukachan also asked about different types of IHHS, so we hope to get the relevant information. Chairman, yes, now rents are very high and property price is skyrocketing. So this is really a problem that we have to face. Well, as the Undersecretary pointed out, to increase supply is very important. You have to develop new sites for housing. And I hope that we can all give in somehow so that more housing can be built. Well, it will take years for lands to be available. If a dozen years ago we started doing this, then the problem can be resolved by now. Well, some may think that long-term solutions are not useful, so that's why you are not using the long-term solutions, and this will eventually cause problems. Because after a number of years, the problem will eventually occur. So for short, medium, and long-term measures, they are all useful. And now the Undersecretary tells us how IHHS can be helped in the short run, and transitional housing is useful. I support this. We've heard about light rooms project and the community housing movement. Well, the number of units may not be many, but they still help. And now we are talking about using MIC for transitional housing. But it seems that you rely too much on NGOs. Well, there are advantages because it's more flexible. However, I would like to ask the government, how are you going to help the NGOs? That would include raising funds and identifying sites and the shortage of professionals, etc. Yes, they may have volunteers. However, in the long run, it's very difficult for them because they really need professional people to help them. The government has the manpower. You have the expertise. Why can't you help them more? I hope the government would build the transitional housing itself. That would be much more helpful. So can the Undersecretary tell me whether they have such a plan? And also for the transitional housing, are there requirements? How about the average floor area per capita? I would like to thank Mr. Chao Wei-Chin for his comments and questions. And thank you for understanding our problems. We encounter a lot of problems when it comes to identifying housing sites. And I would like to answer Mr. Chair's questions. About the area per capita, we have a standard. So for each person, it's about 7 square meter. This is the bottom line. As for the Nam Chung Street project, a one-person unit has an area of about 12 to 15 square meters. Well, because we are aiming at building dignified housing for people. However, in Hong Kong, there are problems, so the units cannot be too big. And when it comes to modular social housing, yes, if NGOs are to build them, it's more flexible. The government's role is a facilitator. When it comes to professionals, well, if they are willing to help, of course, that will be much welcome. And for financial assistance, that would also include paying professionals. When NGOs come to apply for funding, they also get the funds for hiring professionals. But if this becomes a government act, then we may not have the innovation and flexibility of NGOs. Different NGOs are serving different types of people. Now, for some NGOs, they want to help CSSA recipients, and for some other NGOs, they are serving single mothers. And some others are serving ethnic minorities. So if it's a government act, then we cannot favor a certain group of people. So that's why we have to be very careful about this. Chairman, yes, I agree that NGOs can help. But the Undersecretary also mentioned this. Now you want professionals to be volunteers. They have their own jobs to do. They cannot help too much. But the government has a lot of professionals. Why can't the government help? And the government professionals know more about the rules. So there would be less problems. If it's for NGOs, then they would have to make a lot of applications. Now for the Sham Shui Po project, originally it should be completed by now. But in terms of procedures, I think they have encountered a lot of difficulties. So you have to do away with the obstacles. We are just talking about transitional housing. It's transitional, so you cannot require them to comply with all the rules of permanent housing. Now, because now you allow them to use MICs, it's much faster. We have to consider this. Now you are giving them a dozen square meters per person. Well, actually, if they are now living in SDUs, the area is much smaller. So for this, you can be more flexible.
咧就係
Otherwise, it will all be just empty talk, and you are not really helping the IHHS. And as for the financial aspect, the administration talked about a dedicating fund, and now I want to stress that very often the procedures will delay matters, and including increase in supply. Many members of the industry are criticizing the application procedures, and I think the Development Bureau should give us an account. So, can the government play a more proactive role in the provision of transitional housing in particular? Because they are temporary in nature, with 2 project directors, can they do more? Thank you. Can the Undersecretary please respond? As regards procedures and other considerations, we've already done a lot. With the establishment of the task force, 2 interdepartmental meetings have been held, and different government departments will try to coordinate as far as possible, and many departments are willing to expedite the implementation of many projects where possible. However, there are certain principles that cannot be compromised, and first is safety, fire safety in particular. However, without jeopardizing fire safety, can there be other alternatives? And this is what the task force is aiming to do. And through interdepartmental meetings, we have already streamlined many of the procedures to expedite the process. Some projects were regionally not feasible because of some requirements, and after our coordination, without jeopardizing safety, now they can proceed. And we will continue to remove the restrictions, hoping that we can be more effective. All right, we still have time for a second round of questions. Mr. Andrew Wen, and who else? Mr. Tony Z and Mr. Cheng Hoi-yen. Thank you. Chairman, just now Mr. Tony Z really hit the nail on his head. If this term of government doesn't work harder to improve, to resolve the problem, then it will really let down the members of the public. I think the root of the problem happened more than a decade ago, when the current Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, was the Development Bureau. When we put this to her at the question time, she reacted rather strongly. All right, we can be forward-looking, and we have to resolve the problem. Whether we talk about transitional housing in industrial buildings or modular social housing scheme, and also conversion of school premises, well, the number of transitional housing provided is limited. Now, the Undersecretary has been telling us that they will press ahead as far as possible. Now, if you talk about removing the red tape and restrictions, I know you're adjusting them, but what about the outcome? Now, we are not just looking at the micro perspective. We are talking about the wider picture of supply in the coming 10-20 years. The government has admitted failure, and it is catching up. And then we must rely on transitional housing in the interim. We're asking how you can enhance the provision of transitional housing in the short term. Yes, we all know that the ultimate solution is to provide PRH. We're not asking you to provide transitional housing on sites that can be used for PRH. I am rather frustrated because people who have followed up on this matter will know that the two are separate. Under Secretary, I think you know that transitional housing and PRH are two different things, so do not mislead the public. Of course, you should identify sites in the long term. I will not repeat this argument, but in the near term, at least 3 to 5 years, if there are vacant sites with no use in the coming 5 years, can you release them for transitional housing? What about those on short-term tenancies and also the site earmarked for expansion of the Hong Kong Disneyland? And you have never directly addressed such suggestions. And then you should not just provide sites bit by bit. Now, you have just given us some rather vague figures. And then you talked about sites that have been occupied, and when we have identified 1 or 2 vacant school sites, and then you say that the university concerned has decided not to use it so it can be released. Why can't you be more transparent? Tell us, give us a list of vacant government schools and what are their planned use, and if they have none planned use in the near future, can they be used for transitional housing? And are you going to establish a dedicated fund? Some members ask for $100 million. No, I think we need at least $1 billion. So are you going to ask the Financial Secretary to set up this dedicated fund in the coming budget? Thank you, Ms. Andrew Wen, for your questions and suggestions. First, on land. My response may be longer than 5 minutes. With your permission, I will continue. Land will only be available after a long time. In 2010, we talked about near shore reclamation outside Victoria. No. He's not answering my question. We are talking about transitional housing. We know full well the difficulties of getting land in the long term. I'm talking about land reserved for Hong Kong Disneyland and SCT and vacant government sites. Well, you mentioned reclamation, so I have to respond. You talk about the government not doing anything. In 2010, we proposed a near-shore reclamation outside Victoria, but we encountered many views and objections. So identifying land and forming land is not easy. All right, talking about the Hong Kong Disneyland. At the last council sitting, there was a motion, and we mentioned that we had to negotiate with Hong Kong Disneyland. Under the contractual spirit, we cannot change the land use unilaterally. I'm very unhappy with this. I'm asking whether you're going to inquire with Hong Kong Disneyland. How come it's okay for you to check with Disneyland to have a flower garden there and not using it for transitional housing? When you enter into an agreement with a commercial entity, there is a contractual spirit. If after the contract is concluded, you want to change the contractual terms, yes, there can always be discussions. But if the change is substantial and inconsistent with the original spirit, then we have to discuss with the contracting party gradually. According to the Lands Department, we've got some data. But these are so-called vacant structures or government schools might have reserved users for other departments, but for whatever reasons, the users are not yet implemented. So the public may have the impression that the school buildings are vacant. For the example I just quoted, it was earmarked by a university for setting up an archive center or a research center, and then we saw the opportunity because the university has given up that plan, and we are now discussing with the lands department, which has given us the first list of sites, and then we will see which of them are feasible for transitional housing. We'll continue to negotiate with the lands department. My question is whether this can be discussed by the education panel. Well, the sites have been left idle for 6-7 years. Can you force the Education Bureau to tell you what are the planned use? I'm sure all land use has got a rationale behind it, and we will try to coordinate and see whether we can have information for members. Mr. Wen talked about a transitional housing fund, a dedicated fund. We've heard your suggestion. We will consider this proposal. In the 2018 budget, the FS earmarked a 1 billion fund, although not dedicated for transitional housing. But so long as the project or the task force on transitional housing approves, an applicant for transitional housing can apply to use it for providing infrastructure. So long as we have measures to support IHHS, we will consider. And as for identifying land in the short term, we are quite concerned too. Yes, 5 years is more desirable. If the tenure is too short, there are advanced works that have to be done, and by then the tenancy period left for the occupants will be very short, and this will be a great disappointment to the tenants if they can only live in a transitional housing unit for a very short time. So we're trying to find vacant land or idle sites. It's not that they do not have dedicated users. It's just that the users will not be implemented in the short term. And we're discussing to use them for transitional housing. I'm afraid he has not answered my second question. I've asked for a list of vacant government buildings and sites and schools, and also the planned users. I ask for such a list. Mr. Tony Z. Our focus is on increasing the supply of transitional housing. Of course, we do care for safety and fire safety in particular. I just want to ask for clearer guidelines for everyone to know, and how we can identify more such sites and buildings for transitional housing. The government can, of course, there are planned long-term use for government sites. For instance, if within 6 years the use cannot be implemented, what will be the problem? I think it is better to do it the other way around. If you ask for the coming 5 years, they may not be willing to do that. Can you do it the other way around? For instance, you want to use a site for the coming 6 years, and you ask a department what problems it will face. Of course, they can give you a lot of reasons, so you should do it the other way around. You should ask the department what will be the difficulties created for it, because we want to help the IHHS, you should ask them what are the difficulties they face if a site is taken away from them for 6 years, and then you will decide whether their arguments are justified. And you should also consider how to encourage using private agricultural land. Many such sites are applying for a change of land use, but it may take 7 to 8 years, and even for paying land premium, it will take them 3 to 4 years. So you should encourage them to do something with some restrictions, of course, and regulations, of course, because the objective is to help the needy. So I hope you can consider this.
And if you use industrial building for transitional housing, if you look at it from a commercial perspective, it's not viable because you just give them 5 years, and we are talking about a complete conversion of the building. So some people may think it's not worth doing. Well, some may want to do it for social benefits. That's another issue. So for using industrial building as transitional housing, I'm not too optimistic unless the government can adjust its policy. But when it comes to subsidies, maybe you can do more. So for the policy on revitalizing industrial buildings, at the end of the day, you just benefit the owners because you didn't collect premium for the conversion. So I hope the government can consider this. Chairman, I don't totally understand the government's policies, but I would like to put this forward, and I hope the government will really do something. And the two project directors here, we hope that multi-pronged approach can be adopted so that we can help those who are inadequately housed. Thank you, Mr. Chia Wei-chun, for your opinions. I agree with many of them. Well, for the guidelines, of course, they should be simpler so that it's more convenient. So for the HKCSS first project, after it's completed, we can learn from its experience. This is the first project. Of course, it would encounter the most problems. And I can also share this with you. We have to consider the structural issues, and also safety is very important. So certain specifications have to be met. So after meeting such requirements, I think the future projects can learn from this. And also there are some other considerations for government lands and properties. Can we look at them as well? Now we are adopting a more proactive attitude. So if there are idle sites or properties, we will take the initiative to ask, that is, whether such sites or premises can be used for transitional housing. So we are not just a facilitator and coordinator. We would also take the initiative to identify such sites. Well, different departments may have different understandings, and even for a term of shorter than 5 years, we would also consider them. So we try to find out as many sites as possible. Yes, you would ask the departments if such sites are available, but of course the departments would like to maintain their sites because they can have flexibility. So I suggest another way around. That is, I would use your site for 5 or 6 years. Is there a problem with you? Well, just ask them the other way around. If I were the department, of course, I'm not willing to give you the site. Of course, people would do that. That's the same for idle schools. In 5 years' time, I may use it. So, of course, it would be best if I keep the sites. So, just can you do it the other way around? Yes, we've heard your view. but we have to talk to other bureaus and departments. As for private sites, that is one of the directions we would look at. As for industrial buildings, yes, we have to take into account the business model. So for the industrial building owner, if he's interested to convert the building into transitional housing, then after 5 years, if he's done a good job, there's no reason for us to turn down his renewal application. For other subsidies, we have to be very careful because it's about the use of public money on private corporates. We still have 3 members who are waiting to ask questions, and Ms. Mack would move a motion as well. Yes, I understand that it's very difficult to identify sites for housing construction, and in the long run, this is the ultimate solution. But for the task force on transitional housing, well, last year it was announced that it would be established, so we hope to get more information from this task force. Just now, Mr. Cheng and Mr. Wang also asked about a list of idle schools. Up to the 3rd of October last year, there are 853 idle sites, including 21 vacant schools. The task force on transitional housing has been operating for half a year, but now we can only get information from the internet. Now, if there are really 21 vacant schools and 853 idle sites, according to the Lands Department, then how many of them can be used for housing right now? Now, maybe you are reserving such sites for the construction of municipal services complex or hospitals in the future, but they may not be used in the coming several years. Do you have a list of that? Well, I want your figures. I do not want internet figures. Just now, Mr. Cheng told us that he has collected data from the internet. And in your paper, you only tell us that there will be 210 transitional housing units. And you have already said no to tenancy control and rent subsidies. So how about giving the public some hope in the near term? And can the task force give us the relevant information? Thank you, Ms. Chen, for your questions. Well, for the Lands Department, on its website, they provide maps, and on the maps you can see sites available for STTs and vacant schools. It seems that the number of vacant schools is not low, but we have looked at such sites. Well, some of the sites may be too small, and some other sites are very remote. For example, some of the schools are village schools, and you may have to walk a long way or walk up a long flight of stairs to reach the campus. And some of them may even be monuments, which have to be conserved. So they are not suitable for rebuilding as transitional housing. Mr. Chia Wei-chin asked about some government lands which may be used in the future. So we will be looking at such vacant properties owned by the government and try to find out whether they can be converted into transitional housing. Just now I mentioned this example several times. The university wanted this site for the storage of documents and for building a research center, but now the university doesn't want it anymore. So for this piece of information, you cannot find it on the reference map. We have a difficulty. That is for transitional housing. It should be more flexible, and also because a lot of uncertainties are involved, so we cannot give you a target number. So with so many uncertainties, it's very difficult to give you concrete figures. Otherwise, confusion and misunderstanding may be caused. Well, for paragraph 28, you said this. Well, there are sites in different districts. So now you already have a list of sites, right? So there are available land scattered in different districts of Hong Kong. So according to paragraph 28, do you have a list? The Lands Department has given us a list. And now we are trying to find out which sites are available. Well, for some of them, the tenancy may be shorter, maybe just 2 to 3 years. So it's not suitable for building transitional housing. Or maybe the location is really good, it's in an urban area, traffic is convenient, but the tenancy may be short. And also the area of the site is also an issue. If it's too big, it's not suitable for transitional housing. But where are these available lands? You said in paragraph 28 that there is a preliminary list of available land. So there is not a site that's suitable right now. Now, some projects are underway. We hope that when these projects are finalized, then we can report to members. Some projects are in progress. The progresses have been okay, but some may encounter difficulties, and some of them may even have to be suspended. So we do not want to cause misunderstanding. We have to be very strict. We have a dozen projects in our hands which are in progress. Some of the projects are in the urban areas, some are in the rural areas, and for some other projects there may be monuments conservation concerns. So we are looking at different problems. One of the sites is in the urban area, is ideal for transitional housing. However, next to it there is a depot for dangerous goods. So in terms of safety, that site cannot be chosen. So we really have to look at the sites very carefully. We cannot just give you a list. Otherwise, confusion and misunderstanding may be caused. I hope you can understand our difficulties. But we are working very hard. For that site I mentioned, we were really unhappy because it has a very good location and it can provide quite a number of transitional housing units. Unfortunately, there's a depot for dangerous goods next to it, so we are really sad. We still have several members who would like to ask questions, and then we will handle Ms. Lesmack's motion. Do we agree that her motions be handled? Yes, then we will do it later. I have two questions. I agree that for transitional housing, it should be community-led, but the government should make more effort. Let me talk about money first. I've been promoting the Yanchao Street project, and I've talked to a lot of NGOs. Well, they are not builders. They don't know how to build housing, so they need a lot of support. And they are all volunteers. So when it comes to construction, it's really not easy, and you need a lot of money. So for community care fund and community chest, they are not professional developers. So even for the Development Bureau, it's not the right bureau to fund it, because this should be under the Transport and Housing Bureau. So when you develop transitional housing, these NGOs really lack resources. So in the coming budget, can you set up a transitional housing fund to support the NGOs? You should do it right away. Otherwise, we will have to wait for a longer time. I understand that there are a dozen NGOs who are providing transitional housing. But you are relying on landlords with conscience. So do you have plans? Well, actually, I know many landlords like this. Well, these landlords may own a dozen walk-ups, and they are willing to help. So will the task force on transitional housing launch certain projects so that these developers or tenement building owners can be encouraged?
Thank you, Chairman, for your questions. And I thank the Chairman for helping us in the Yam Chao Street project. We agree that the expertise of NGOs is to provide social services, and housing projects are not their mainstay, but we maintain very close liaison with them to offer assistance. I agree that there is room for improvement as far as government support is concerned. Take the community housing movement of HACSS in Nam Chong Street concerned. Now we have helped them to apply for funding under the Community Care Fund, and with the establishment of the Task Force on Transitional Housing, it has helped it to deal with many documents requirement for the CCF, and it's also given a lot of advice and in document processing and also preparing the contracts. As for setting up a dedicated fund, yes, we've heard the view, and I understand that Mr. Andrew Wen would like it to be of a bigger size. And then, Chairman, you also propose a 2 billion dedicated fund for transitional housing. We've heard all these, and we will give very careful and serious consideration to such proposals. In the 2017 policy address, within the THB, we have set up a window to deal with transitional housing. We have received inquiries from many organizations on transitional housing projects. They have also got some projects which they want to use for transitional housing. And then with the establishment of the task force, our assistance to such initiatives have been more proactive. And we've done a lot in encouraging such projects. We want to make use of successful cases to show the community that the kind of assistance can be offered through transitional housing and how a building can be revitalized for such use. For instance, in urban redevelopment, a property developer might have got some old buildings, and they can rent it to NGOs at a nominal rent. NGOs can also make use of social resources such as electrical appliances donated by members of the public, and using community resources for conversion. And we would like to mobilize community resources to do more. The task force on transitional housing will be more proactive in doing such things. You may think that we are rather conservative, and we don't want to announce premature initiatives, but we hope that when we make announcements, we can turn them into examples, so the people who have the will can use such projects to help those who have the need. over 200 units have benefited under the modular social housing scheme. They are not just offered a dignified accommodation, they are giving support emotionally, and some of them were under great stress when they lived in STU, and through the modular social housing scheme, many of them have seen improvements psychologically and mentally. I hope you can widen the window. Not too many people are aware of such schemes at the time being. Ms. Alice Mack. There is no need for the Undersecretary to tell us the merits of the modular social housing scheme. We know already. All right, the task force is established with the 2 project directors here. When do you expect you can launch another transitional housing scheme at the earliest? And members would like to know the number of such projects you have in hand and when you can release information on such projects. From the point of site identification to completion with your promotion and facilitation, actually how long does it require? Thank you, Ms. Alice Mack, for your very specific questions. When can we announce the next transitional housing project? Now, I don't want to be too specific. Take for an example, in last December, we had considerable progress with an NGO, with an organization, and all of a sudden we were told that they had some matters requiring their internal coordination, and the project might have to be delayed. So originally we wanted to announce the project this month, but because of in-house matters of the organization, it has to be deferred. So I dare not be too specific. I can only say that in the first half of this year, we will have more than 1 project to be announced. And they are now at a very detailed stage already. We hope that in the first half of this year, we can have 2 or 3 projects to be announced. We're quite confident that you will feel the success of our efforts. We have more than a dozen different projects in different stages. Some are on government land, some on government buildings, some are vacant government schools, some involve private residential buildings. So you asked the time required from the start of a project to completion. It is hard to generalize. Some of the projects may be easier to tackle, but there are some that involve more issues and they will take longer. For instance, it may be the conversion of an existing building, refurbishment. So you may say that refurbishment takes relatively a short time, but then there may be lease conditions that have to be sorted out. For instance, in that case, the number of the street was missing. And how come that was the case? It took us a few months to resolve the historical problems. So it is hard to give you an exact time frame. If everything goes smoothly, if it is just refurbishment of an existing building, then it is going to be rather soon. Well, you said that my questions were specific and I expected specific answers. I'm sorry, I haven't got it from you, with the exception that there will be 1 more transitional housing project announced in the first half of this year. I ask such specific issues because I want to know how confident the government is about launching transitional housing. Now, you can't be sure, and you said that in a certain case the NGO decided to defer it for a while. That being the case, how can you convince us that by means of transitional housing we can address the needs of IHHS? I wanted to know how confident you were, and well, is not that we are too weak on we lack the will. We really want your support. We have encountered many difficulties, but there are always more solutions than problems. The task force has worked very hard to overcome the problems, and it is not going to be deterred. It's just that we are willing to be more accountable to the council. But when it comes to very specific questions on timing, it is hard for me to say because each project is different. Whenever we receive a proposal, we will get back to it ASAP to look at the feasibility, technical feasibility. No, I'm sorry. Under Secretary, I don't want to be in the way of other members. I just want to know how confident you are in launching transitional housing projects. And now you said that you dare not tell us too much because many things are still under study or consideration. It's not just you. There are many cases with this government that they would only announce the schemes or programs when everything is ready, thinking that you can get our approval. Of course, we support you, but you should not wait until you have done everything behind closed doors and launch them and win applause. Now, we ask for information not to take you accountable. We just want to have the information so we can help you. Because when you announce a scheme, you may expect applause, and the public may tell you that this scheme doesn't work. So please don't that you can get a big hand after you have done everything behind closed doors on your own and come and announce the plan. Thank you. We have no intention to do that. Take the Yam Chao Street project as an example. We've done a lot behind the scene, but we only announce it when it is already mature. Even after we have announced the Yam Chao Street project, there are still a lot of work to be done and a lot of technical issues to address. It's not that we only launch it when everything is ready. We just want to have an informed discussion in the community for our projects. Dr. Fernando Zhang. Well, I apologize for being late. I had a meeting with the Housing Authority earlier this morning. I understand that the administration has set up a task force on transitional housing, and it has also reserved $1 billion for NGOs to apply for, so that we can have self-financing transitional housing projects launched very soon. Now, for government vacant land, there are over 600 sites. And there is great potential for them to be developed. I just want to know whether the administration has any rough plan to use vacant government sites and buildings. For instance, in the coming 5 years, how many transitional housing units can be provided? Now, for instance, we have a lighthouse, when HKCSS and SOCO have also developed some community housing, and some of the NGOs have also chipped in. What scale are you expecting? These NGOs may have funds and you're willing to assist, but they need a lot of support in developing transitional housing, whether we are talking about experience and knowledge and negotiation with government departments. Well, even if you're baking a cake, you will tell people who are hungry and waiting for the cake, how many cakes are you going to provide them, so that they have reasonable expectations. You should not just set out the conditions and ask whoever is interested in helping to bake the cake to come out, so that people who are waiting and hungry can have cake. So is there any planning on your part, Under Secretary? Thank you, Dr. Fernando Zhang, for your questions. Regarding planning, well, I think it's a bit difficult because we cannot envisage the scale of each project because the number of units that can be provided in one building may not be the same. So I dare not tell you how many we can provide in the coming 5 years. We can only promise to do our best. However, there are a few projects in the pipeline. We expect that in the first half of this year, there will at least be 2 to 3 projects to be announced. And if they are successful, they can provide around 300 units. That I can be more specific, but as for the actual number, it all depends on the specific design.
Because we have to look at the geographical situations, and some of the original designs may have to be redone. Now, for the Nam Chang Street project, due to the geographical factors, we had to make changes to the design, and the number of units has to be adjusted. You mentioned some other NGO, for example, Lightsby, Light Rooms, and Soko. They have different plans. For Light Rooms, each project is different as well. So one project is not the same as others. The task force hopes to help in terms of administration and legislation. We try to remove obstacles for them so that we can provide a one-stop service to the NGOs. And also we have interdepartmental meetings to help them. We hope that we can reduce the red tapes for the NGOs, and their problems can be resolved as soon as possible. And as a result, transitional housing can be provided ASAP. You don't have any plans, but at least can the government look at the vacant sites, and you should accord priorities to different sites. And for example, some sites are really remote, or they are on dangerous slopes, and they do not have sufficient infrastructure, etc. So for some other sites, maybe they are more readily usable. So can you make a list of that? Of course, you have to conduct feasibility studies. But according to your experts' views, maybe you can give us an assessment. That is, for a certain site, maybe a certain number of units can be built, and roughly how much it would cost, etc., so that the whole issue can be more transparent and it will be easier for the NGOs. Yes, we are working towards this direction. So when we look at sites, we would look at the feasibility, and if it's quite feasible, then we will take the initiative to contact NGOs, asking them for help. Just now, several members also mentioned this. That is whether there is a list. And I said, in terms of actual operation, there are problems to come up with such a list. I'll go back and look at it and see how we can disclose all information, because we do not want to give unrealistic data to the public. Otherwise, there may be misunderstandings. Now, we still have Mr. Andrew Wen who would like to ask his third round questions. Any other members who would like to ask questions? Because we still have to handle Ms. Alice Mack's motions. Mr. Wen, I'll try to be more straightforward. I want the government to be more proactive. The Undersecretary says that the government is to support, to facilitate. And it seems that the government has become an NGO itself. Now, is community-led, you say, is the best? Yes, it has its advantages. However, this time around it's a bit different because it's about the supply of land. And this is always led by the government. Can you force certain government departments to surrender sites for temporary users? You can take the lead. Now you have 500 STT sites. For those that are bigger than 0.05 hectares, you have many, and it's like 10 times of the area of Taikushing. And even if you give us 5%, you still have 15 hectares. So this is just an example. Can the government promise us to be more proactive? And also for revitalizing industrial buildings, I have a suggestion. So for industrial buildings, many of the units may be idle. So can the URA help? Can you think out of the box? For industrial buildings that are close to urban areas, can the industrial buildings be rebuilt as residential buildings? Well, thank you for your questions. Members hope that the governments can be more proactive. However, we have to strike a balance. Well, for the positioning of transitional housing is to provide a short-term support. So for NGOs, they are more flexible and they can offer help. So the government's role is to provide PLH, GSH, and SSFs. This is to enrich the public's housing ladder, and the long-term solution is to identify more sites. As for the task force on transitional housing, it's very proactive when it comes to identifying sites suitable for transitional housing. So for STT sites, you said that they can be used for transitional housing. Yes, the number is huge. However, you have to consider this. For many STT sites, now they are being used. Some are used for car parks, and car parks are lacking in many districts. So if you use STT sites for housing, this may cause other problems such as illegal parkings. And also for some other STT sites, they are supporting logistic operations. So if we resume such sites for transitional housing, you may solve one problem, but there may be other problems because we also need sites for logistic support. So there are sites that may have a long-term plans for them already, but they are not being used for the moment, so we may buy time and use them for several years. As for redevelopment, we would have to look at the landlord's own considerations. Now, do they have to pay premium, or do they have other plans in mind? Now we are handling a number of applications concerning industrial buildings. We hope that we can do this as soon as possible. Now, if a case is successful, then it would show the public that there are other solutions as well. Okay, if there are no other questions, now we will handle Ms. Alice Mack's motions. Ms. Mack, can you tell us about your motions? Can you read out your motion? Well, they are tabled. Well, we before the governments can increase the supply of public housing and reducing the waiting time to 3 years, the government should provide measures to help the IHHS. For example, for those who have been waiting for more than 3 years for PRH, the government should provide rent subsidy, and it should impose tenancy control and vacancy tax. And also, the government should also compile statistics every year concerning SDUs, and it should also get information concerning the rental level of SDUs, and also it should require the tenancy agreements of SDUs to be in written form and be stamped so that grassroots tenants' rights can be protected. I think members should understand why I am proposing rent subsidy, tenancy control, and vacancy tax. Government, would you like to respond? No response. Okay, now let's vote. For those who are in favor of the motion, please raise their hands. For those who are against, please raise their hands. Those who abstain, the motion is passed. Okay, there's no AOB. Oh, that's another motion. Ms. Alice Mack. Well, when it comes to the construction of transitional housing by the community, there are a lot of difficulties. We hope that the government will develop its own transitional housing so that the problems for the housing problems or the IHHS can be resolved. This would include formulating a yearly supply targets for transitional housing and enlarging the scales of the task force on transitional housing. And there should be a cross-borough approach to provide support to transitional housing. And there should be a dedicated fund for transitional housing. And this can become the financial. This can provide financial commitment for the NGOs who are providing transitional housing. Okay, now let's vote. For those who are in favor of the motion, please raise their hands. For those who object, please raise their hands. For those who abstain, please raise their hands. I declare that the motion is passed. Now the two motions have been handled. We are moving on to agenda item 4. Now it's AOB. Date of next meeting, afternoon of the 19th of February. I'm sure the government has heard members' questions. So next time, I hope you can provide us with more information, for example, the list, etc. So, okay, thank you for attending the meeting.